Sveiki, sveiki, čia vėl Vincentas Pulvinskas ir sveiki sugrįžę į Lietuvą Ameriką. Šiandien kiek kitoks epizodas. Turiu pasakyti, biškį pasišpagavome su mūsų svečiu Ian Brzezinski, amerikiečių saugumo politikos ekspertu, žmogumi, kuris iš vidaus mato tiek JAV vidaus diskusijas, tiek transatlantinius santykius. Padiskutavome ne tik apie tai, ką Amerika galvoja apie Europą, bet ir apie tai, ką Europa turėtų daryti, kad liktų strategiškai reikšminga. Kalbam apie skirtingus požiūrius į partnerystę tarp JAV ir ES, apie Europos gebėjimą atsistoti ant savo kojų ir apie tai, ar transatlantinis ryšys šiandien vis dar būtinas, ar jau tik sentimentali atmintis. Kągi, klausykit, nes šio pokalbio metu ne viską mes sutarėme. Bet būtent dėl to šis pokalbis, manau, ir bus ir yra vertingas. Gero klausimo.
You know, when I was preparing myself for this conversation with you, I remembered our fathers because my father then was the rector of Vilnius University, and I still remember pictures with your father when he was decorating him with this honorary doctorate degree of Vilnius University. But sorry, of course, to go into your family. I want to provoke you with something that your late father was always telling me, because he wasn't like first point on any program of any Lithuanian I was bringing during my ambassador, term in DC. He was telling me, Žygis, this is not Reagan. This is John Paul II who did everything. But he said, I could still write a book about that, but I think it's still too early. So my question to provoke a bit about that. So is it always those Lithuanians and Poles who have to wake up Americans to do the right thing? We are, waking up, trying to do, Kubilius defense commissioner trying to do the good stuff, waking up Germans. Actually he's today in Berlin, I think. So, we try to arm to teeth and face the Russians. But is it the way to wake up Americans always through those Europeans, because they are always doing some kind of wrong choices there?
Well, America's always late to the party. We're always knocking on the wrong doors, but we eventually get there and it ends well. But it's voices from Central Europe that sometimes help us wake up a little bit earlier and get to the right door quicker. And that is urgently needed today. And the good news is that I think finally in my lifetime, the voices from your region in the world, the Lithuanians, the Estonians, the Poles, their voices are recognized as having a basis in truth and in history. It's being given greater credibility here in Washington, not necessarily by all, but by more. And by all, I sometimes wonder if our friends in the White House are really among that group that recognize that, even though they tend to listen to Central Europeans a little bit more than the West Europeans.
But Jan, was it always so difficult? I was still kind of kid or student when first NATO enlargement happened. Then when second, I was already operating. But was it always so difficult to convince Americans to do the right thing? Because from my books, I'm still reading about Reagan, John Paul II, more or less every evening. It was, America leading, at least in those books.
Sure. Look, what I was saying is a little bit tongue in cheek. I mean, United States, came late to World War I. It came late to World War II, after going through a period where we had a fierce debate on whether or not we had any interests in Europe during World War II. We had our own American First movement in that interwar period. But we got there and we helped win and defeat the Axis. And we learned our lessons from that. And we set up institutions like the United Nations. We were enthusiastic about the European Union, the European Steel Community before that. And of course, we were drivers behind the effort to stand up NATO. And, during the Cold War period, we were there in force. We were ready to fight. We had 300,000 U.S. troops lined up on the border. Many of those divisions had brigades, battalions, if not brigades, with engines running. They'd rotate it. That's how ready and committed we were to the security. Sometimes our forward-leaning approach to taking on challenges quickly and early led us to make some mistakes. Vietnam, and you could even argue Iraq, but some good stories. The Iraq invasion of Kuwait, and George Bush 1 pushed back very forcefully and very quickly with the international coalition. So we weren't always late to the party, so to speak, always late to the right door. But now I think we seem to have forgotten a little bit, at least our senior leadership, elected leadership now. And I'm talking both the Trump administration and the Biden administration don't seem to understand the urgency that we have with the crisis in Eastern Europe. And we seem to not even recognize the overwhelming overmatch of power we have on our adversaries and the benefits of acting quickly and decisively, as opposed to kind of delaying and procrastinating, allowing the problem to become more dangerous and the solution more costly.
One thing, I mean, you do very well, Mr. Brzezinski, to recall the past and how much America has done for the world in the past for maintaining the liberal world order, to make sure that freedom has a right to exist and to play, but bringing it back to modern day. I mean, let's talk brass tacks. Uh, what will it take to have America remember its role and its responsibility to not only Europe but to the rest of the world? What will it take for America to wake up again? What is that Pearl Harbor moment now?
Well, I'm hoping we don't have to have a Pearl Harbor moment. Um, you know, Pearl Harbor moments have the benefit of waking us up into action. But when I think of Pearl Harbor, I think of the tremendous cost of World War II. And my hope is that, strong leadership, uh, a will to fight, a willingness to exercise fully the power the Europeans have in support of the Ukrainians could possibly be something that will capture America's attention and convince us to kind of weigh in with our power robustly to put that war to an end on terms that are just and that on terms that will ensure long-term, at least military stability in the region. So my hope is that Europe will act more decisively and more quickly. It already is in some respects. I mean, it's Starmer, it's President Macron in France, who are leading an effort to create a deterrent force. Europe's finally recognizing it's underarmed. It's allowed its defense capabilities to deteriorate over these last decades, and they're beginning to put money in there. But the moment is now to use what Europe has at the moment, militarily, ideologically, and economically against Russia. Because the United States is not, certainly under Trump, is not going to do any more than Europe does. And right now, Trump doesn't really believe that Europe is really committed to defense of Ukraine. And it's true. There's still Russian energy being bought by Europeans as we speak. There's still economic engagement with Russia as we speak. The Europeans haven't really pulled the full force of the economic sanctions that they could exercise on the Russians. They haven't mobilized any forces in response to this invasion. I don't see any significant movements of forces to, Lithuania's borders. I mean, the Germans are still talking about 2027. I don't see any significant deployment of European forces to Poland or West European forces to Poland, West European forces to Romania. These are things it needs to do now. I don't see a sudden increase of economic pressure on Russia. These are things that Europe needs to do now to demonstrate it is really committed to NATO, to Ukraine's security. It's willing to really stand up for its own security interests. That, to me, is absolutely necessary if we're going to convince the current administration in Washington to kind of leverage in and support that effort with the full weight of American power.
Yeah, just again, I'm always trying to provoke, good friends. I was in Brussels today with Vincent, and I was thinking, well, we just, released new financial instruments, 800 million. Okay, it's not, so nice like it looks, but, Germans just today confirmed in their Bundesrat the decision to go to 500 billion. Europe is like slow but huge train. And if you start moving it, what happens if we really do it, what you say, in 2, 3 years, and then Americans are waking up? It might be too late because, there is a lot of disappointment. For example, okay, I will cite one German who said yesterday, Americans came to Germany to annihilate fascism. And when they hear Vice President speaking, in favor of AfD, who is fascist and, well, pro-Russian and most anti-American force, they are insulted. They are shocked. It's not America of Reagan. It's something else because you empower the radical forces that actually destroy us from inside. Maybe it's too much, but don't you think that, by pushing Europe to be very strong, in 2, 3 years, it will not be, Americans will not be any more so welcome. We have tariffs maybe happening already next week. So
I hear you. I mean, the Trump administration is undertaking a series of policies that are significantly eroding European confidence in the transatlantic relationship. I mean, these policies range from our pressure on Ukraine, our overtures to Russia, our tariffs, our detainment of, normal Europeans just seeking to visit America at our airports, attending them for weeks, and under our immigration laws. It's outrageous. The issue really at hand right now is what are we going to do to help Ukraine? And this is not an issue that's going to, quote unquote, be resolved by $800 billion, which is a good amount of investment over 5 years. But Ukraine doesn't have 5 years. It's going to be what, Europe does now with the assets it has in hand, militarily, economically, ideologically, diplomatically, and such. Not only just to reinforce the Ukrainians, but to motivate the United States, and particularly the Trump administration, to do what needs to be done. In this case, really putting the hammer down on the Russians. Doing more to support the opposition within Russia. Leveraging U.S. economic power to leverage the Russian economy, to shut down the war economy, the war industry in Russia. Being part of a European deterrent force, making a deterrent force very visible to the Russians, if not in Ukraine. And my argument would be that the larger the force the Europeans can put together, the more likely they're going to have the United States backstop it. To use that phrase, has now become very, very popular. That's because mass conveys two things: one, commitment, and two, capability. And the capability, the greater it is, increases the prospects of success, and Trump likes to be part of successes. So when we talk about the transatlantic relationship, I fully recognize the damage the Trump administration is doing to it, but I actually believe the ball is really in Europe's hand when it comes down to the future of the transatlantic relationship, how it responds to the crisis at hand, and how it responds to Trump. And right now, the most important mission is helping the Ukrainians and putting the Russians on the defensive. The Europeans have the capacity to do that, but it'll be so much more easier if the United States is with it. And I really believe that Europe has no choice. If it doesn't take that action, it's going to lose Ukraine, and it's going to be a worse situation in Europe with a wider war. If it takes action, not only can it defeat Russia, it's more likely going to have the United States support it, because it's going to be demonstrating commitment, and Trump will want to be part of an outcome that is a victory, that is a win, rather than standing on the side looking weak.
agree. Vincent, please.
So it's all fine and well what you've said, but what worries me is the fact that, notwithstanding the fact that ever since Trump took office for a second time, we in Europe have gone through great lengths to not only increase but to continue our support of Ukraine. We relatively recently approved yet another multi-billion euro aid package to Ukraine, of not only lethal, non-lethal aid, but also of just loans and cash in order to be able to buy weapons. But while we're doing this, it seems like the White House is actively working against us, with at times cutting off the military intelligence to Ukraine, which, I mean, you have to admit, it's to put it mildly, it's not of great help when it comes to, first and foremost, maintaining the transatlantic relationship, and second of all, it's counterproductive to what you said as the most important thing in that relationship right now, which is helping Ukraine win. So what I'm concerned about is that if and when we step up, and we are stepping up, I wonder if there will be anything of that transatlantic relationship left to salvage, and I wonder if Europe will move on in terms of its relations with the States, as it does with Brazil, for example, a huge country, a trading partner, but not more than that necessarily.
Look, there are three routes that Trump is going to take. He's either going to unilaterally impose a very unjust and therefore unstable peace on Ukraine, or two, he's going to walk away because he feels this is not resolvable and he doesn't want to waste any more of his political capital on it. And the third outcome, and I'll go out on a limb here, would be the anti-Biden approach, to actually leverage U.S. force decisively to support Ukraine. The question for Europe is, how does it shape Trump's direction, the choice that he makes, 1, 2, or 3? And I would argue if the Europeans continue on their current track, which is kind of indecisive, long term, you're going to end up probably with track 1 or 2. But if you take more decisive action, and some initial steps have been taken in that direction, but still insufficient, and put a robust deterrent force on the table, demonstrate a readiness, if not already launching, a real escalation in economic sanction and other steps to put pressure on Putin, you're more likely to get the third option, that Trump will try and join in and leverage American power, to secure a just end that brings an enduring military stability to Europe's eastern frontier. I'm pretty confident if Europe doesn't do that, options 1 and 2 are almost inevitable.
Jan, just to ask you, as old friend of Baltics and Poland, I still hope that we do the right thing in Europe, and I still hope that we keep that transatlantic link alive. But if we go to Ukraine, with whatever we have, threat to Baltics and Poland will increase because, Russians will try to deter us pushing Europeans to Ukraine. Do you think we could then ask Americans to build even a bigger military presence in the Baltics and Poland? Because, this is the threshold moment.
I think it's going to be very hard to convince Trump administration to build up our forces in Europe. Next administration may be different, because I really think Trump is a temporal phenomenon, not an indication of what our future 5 years, 10 years is going to look like. So I'm not optimistic about convincing Trump to put more troops in Europe. I do think there's a reasonable chance you could convince Trump to use our current military posture there more decisively. I do believe you could convince Trump to really leverage American power more decisively against Putin. But in order to do that, can't be Europeans pleading for America to lead, pleading for America to carry the burden. It has to be, to use a phrase I just heard the other day, which I think is really good, is establishing strategic parity with the United States. And in the long term, that means, executing those investments that the EU is moving forward with, that European nations are moving forward with. But in the near term, it means acting decisively with the capabilities you have on hand. And strategic parity, I think, is probably what we've always been looking for in the U.S.-European relationship. And right now, it's probably the requisite to get the United States to be more forceful in its response to Putin's brutal and unjust aggression against Ukraine. Not to mention its provocations and aggressions across Europe, in the realm of hybrid warfare.
Okay, last question, Vincentus. from
I'll
your
just
side.
keep this brief. And I agree to a certain extent with most of what you're saying, Mr. Brzezinski. But one issue I do find is that what with the idea of strategic parity is that Europe can't ever really become strategically equal to the States, because for the simple fact of us not being a unified country. We are many different countries with many different political systems and policies. So, and as much as we'd love to in Lithuania to have the Spanish, the Italians, the French to be on our and the Polish level of investing in our defense, investing in aggressive policies when it comes to keeping our borders safe, and so on and so forth. We just can't do that because we're two different countries with we're several different countries with different outlooks on the world, and that's why the strategic parity idea will never work. And so, how do we work with the Trump administration in order for them to understand this? Because while we may be trying, again, the Southerners might not. So we have to work in this sort of way. And I don't think it's fair for you guys stateside to look at us as one object, because we're not, and we can't operate as one.
Well, when the United States looks at Europe, it looks at it as a community and as a partner. And that's what Europe has articulated over and over again and wants us to do. It's unsustainable to have the United States carrying 2/3 of the security burden for Europe's security. I mean, that's just not equal, not fair. Even I can't even really accept that. And Trumpism, Trump's approach to Europe in many ways is a product of the failure of Europe to live up to its responsibilities. I mean, you can't come to Washington and say, we have the same we have the same level standards of living as you do. We're one of the wealthiest communities in the world, but we expect you to cover 2/3 of our security. That's just not going to cut it. Um, that's going to erode, and that actually has eroded commitment to Europe, even on the center left side of the political dividing line here in Washington. So Trump and his approach to Europe, in many ways, is an outcome of Europe's own making, because of its failure to live up to its own responsibility. And parity, may not be perfect parity, but we sure as hell are not at it now. And Europe does have the capacity to do this. And right now it has the urgency of the moment that can compel that kind of action, or that I believe should be compelling that kind of action. And actually, I'm kind of optimistic because I'm seeing, the calls that Lithuania has been making for decades. Poland is making for decades, Estonians for decades, even the Nordics quietly in their own way is now beginning to resonate in Brussels, in Paris, even in Italy. Europeans are beginning to stand up. So I think parity is something that we can debate, whether it can be fully achieved or exceeded or not. But there's definitely more will now than there was before. I'm just worried that will isn't going to be translated into action in short enough a time span. I'm talking literally like weeks, because of the situation in Ukraine. Because if Ukraine falls, that's going to be the end of the transatlantic relationship.
Well, I don't want to finish on that negative note. Last question, really 1 minute question. Jan, you saw it all, our fight, Lithuanians and Poles trying to wake up Americans, and your father did historic job. Thanks to him, we are alive, we are happy, limbing up with his happiness index each year. But what can we do better in Washington, D.C.? Next week, we meet together with friends of Ukraine. to compare with Lithuanians and Poles, I don't think that Ukrainians are so well organized to this fight in America. How can we help Ukrainians to do what we did together? How can we make it more effective without waiting Pearl Harbor to happen?
I think the arguments you need to bring to Washington are really arguments you have to target on the Trump administration and President Trump himself. And the arguments I think that could be most effective would be as follows. First, there has to be action. It just can't be more rhetoric. There's got to be, demonstration that Europe is in on this fight fully, not half-heartedly. So that's the deterrent force. For me, it's 3 divisions, 60,000 folks with a robust air cover, robust air and missile defense, robust long-range fires, a willingness to deploy, maybe even movement and pre-positioning I know you can't do that in 2 weeks, but pre-positioning of assets in Poland, a ratcheting up and positioning of real hard-hitting economic sanctions. Quote unquote, action that demonstrates Europe is now serious and it's ready to move militarily and economically to support Ukraine decisively. And then you come to Washington and you say, hey, Mr. President, we really need you to support us on this, because if there's a failure in Ukraine, we're going to have a wider war. And a war that drags in the United States is the one thing that Trump fears. He's always very proud about how during his tenure in the first term of his presidency, he never dragged America into another endless war, quote unquote, like all his predecessors did, as he likes to put it. He's really worried about that. And the one thing that can capture his attention is his fear of a wider war that engulfs the United States, particularly one that could expand to the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific. The second argument is that, a decisive outcome in this war that is to the maximum extent just, that provides a framework for long-term stability, that's critical to the credibility of the president's national security policy of peace through strength, and the president's own personality, or his own credibility as a tough-minded leader. A third factor would be, Mr. President, all we're asking you to do is backstop this force with 10%. And it can be all rear echelon. That's 60,000, that's 3 divisions. All they're asking the United States is a headquarters element, reinforce the force with American aircraft, long-range fires, and missile defense. It can be all rear echelon with the Europeans being forward. That, Mr. President, I would say, is the kind of burden sharing America has been looking for decades. And you'll be the first American president to have delivered that. And then finally, I'd say, Mr. President, you are on the cusp of achieving this. But we're a little bit worried the direction you're taking by kind of forcing on your terms unilateral concessions by the Ukrainians on territory, conceding to Russia the accountability that Putin should be experiencing for his atrocities and his destruction. That just is going to embolden Putin, make him dig in his, become even more confident in his ability to achieve his aims in Ukraine, and will be a green light for hegemons elsewhere in the world. So you need to shift and join us in this pressure to bring peace back to Europe, for which you will take great credibility. You're this close to it. So those are the 4 arguments that I'd recommend when you come to Washington that you make to the administration.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you for your friendship, for your wisdom, for everything you and your dad did for us, really.
Listen, Montes, thank you for your leadership. I always so impressed by the international coalitions you bring to Washington, because they really do resonate here. And all transatlanticists should be grateful for your leadership. And Vincentas, it's a real pleasure, and thank you for pushing me on these issues.
Well, thank you for not, for taking it.
Thank you, Jan. See you next week.
Great. You bet.
Na kągi, pokalbis su svečiu Ian Brzezinski buvo tikrai ramus, argumentuotas ir naudingas. Palygome europietišką ir amerikietišką požiūrį į saugumą, aptarėme, ką kiekviena pusė mato kaip stiprybę, o kur silpnumus. Aišku viena, transatlantinis ryšys tebėra svarbus, bet jis nebėra toks savaime suprantamas kaip anksčiau. Amerikiečiai sako, kad jei Europa nori būti rimtai vertinama, jau turi būti strategiškai aktyvi, pasiruošusi investuoti į savo gynybą ir kalbėti su ją ne tik kaip rašytoja, bet ir kaip partnerė. Tuo pačiu Amerika turi nuspręsti, ar jai vis dar rūpi sąjungininkai, kurie šimtmečiai stovėjo šalia jos. Ačiū, kad klausėtės. Jei šis pokalbis buvo įdomus, pasidalinkit, įvertinkit ir jei dar to nepadarėt, prenumeruokit. Iki greito, iki sekančio ir iki malonaus.